Well, can I welcome everybody to this event this morning? We've got Pav Singh coming to talk to us about 1984 and the massacre of Sikhs in India. But before we move on to that, I have a few comments I want to make about this event and about the weekend events in general. The first one is that I want to welcome everybody to the annual Bloody Sunday commemoration, which is held every year in Derry. 49 years ago today, 14 people were killed on the streets of Derry and 14 were wounded as they took part in a civil rights march. And of course, they were shot dead by members of the British Parachute Regiment. As it happens, this is also the 73rd anniversary of the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi, which obviously will have real resonance for many of people from India or whose relatives are from India. Today's events are hosted by the Bloody Sunday Trust, the Museum of Free Derry, and the Pat Finucane Centre. And this particular event will appear eventually on the Museum of Free Derry's YouTube channel. You just put Museum of Free Derry in the search engine and that will find it for you. You'll see that there's a chat function at the bottom of your screen, and we want to use this for questions as well as comments. So if any of you have any questions as you listen to Pav speak, put them in the chat function, and what we'll do at the end is we will go through some of those questions, and hopefully Pav will answer them. I just want to say, first of all, that we want to welcome members of the Sikh community to this event. Derry has the largest Sikh community in Ireland, and in fact, the first Gurdwara was opened here some years ago. So there are other connections actually between Derry and the Punjab, which I don't really want to go into because they're mainly colonial ones. But if I just mention the name of John Lawrence, whose statue is Bidecks Foyle Grammar School here, people will know that he was actually the governor of the Punjab at the time of the Indian uprising in 1857. So there are historic links between this city and the Punjab, which of course is where the majority of Sikhs live. Okay, enough of me. Can I now introduce you to Pav Singh, who should be on your screen. He's a journalist who comes from Leeds, but currently lives in Buckinghamshire. In 2017, he published this book, 1984, India's Guilty Secret. I've read it, obviously, and it's a very well documented book about what actually happened in the end of October, beginning of November, mainly in Delhi, but elsewhere too, in India, following the assassination of the Indian Prime Minister, Mrs Gandhi. The book's published by the Kashi House, which is a book company that specializes in publishing all matters Punjabi. So without more ado, I'll now start directing my comments to Pav, and the first thing I want to ask you, Pav Singh, is what are your own recollections of 1984 and the events in India at that time?
Thank you, Robin, for that introduction, and thanks for having me and inviting me to this event. Quite poignant that tomorrow is the anniversary of Sunday, Bloody Sunday, as well. So it's quite an honour for me to be here. So my recollection was, I mean, I was a teenager grown up in Leeds when I heard the news of the assassination of Mrs Gandhi. So I heard the news in the morning while getting ready for school. I was in sixth form at the time, and it was very, very shocking for us to hear of the news, and more shocking the fact that we had family in Delhi on my mum's side who were affected. Luckily, they survived the massacres. They were taken in by their Hindu neighbours. Many Hindus and Muslims actually helped Sikhs in those fateful days, where there was virtual mob rule throughout northern India. So as my sort of recollection, basically straight away when the assassination happened and when Mrs Gandhi's death was declared, and then I followed events through my family, but more importantly, when I sort of 10 years later went to India and spent a year in India researching for the book, that's when I met the victims and the survivors of that genocide. And it's really dawned on me then that this story hadn't been told properly, the truth hadn't come out, and hence the reason why it's called India's guilty secret.
Okay, before we move on to the actual events of 1984, perhaps you could tell us something about the Sikh community itself in India. I mean, it's not a particularly large community, am I right in saying?
Yeah, you're right, actually. I mean, it's only 2%, makes 2% of the Indian population. India is a majority Hindu nation, 80% Hindu, and the rest are Muslims, Christians, and Sikhs. So a very small minority, although they do have a slim majority in the state of Punjab. But generally throughout India, very, very small minority.
Okay, in terms of the events of 1984, I mean, what particular the event that triggered off the killings was the assassination of Mrs Gandhi. What was the background to that? I mean, why was she assassinated? Who assassinated her? Why was she assassinated?
Yeah, so I'll take you back to a few months before that, an event that took place in June '84, which the assassins justified. The two Sikh bodyguards who assassinated Mrs Gandhi justified that assassination in revenge of the attack on the Golden Temple in Amritsar in June 1984. So this is an event that Mrs Gandhi ordered the Indian Army to go into. I don't know if many of your listeners know of the Golden Temple, but it's the holiest shrine for Sikhs, and not only for Sikhs, for all faiths. In fact, it has 4 doors to welcome all creeds and all castes. The foundation stone of the Golden Temple was laid by a Muslim saint, and the hymns that are sung from the holy book, the Guru Granth Sahib, which includes the hymns of Hindus and Sikh saints and Muslim saints. So it's a very inclusive faith, and it's a very inclusive site. And for any government to send the cavalry battalions and tanks into a very small confined area, very reminiscent of the massacre in 1919 when the British killed thousands in a place called Jallianwala Bagh, which is literally 10 minutes away, stone throw away from the Golden Temple in Amritsar. For them to attack on a day without warning, on one of the busiest days in the Sikh calendar, it was the martyrdom of the 5th Guru. So the place was full of pilgrims, lots of people who came on, tractors and trolleys from the villages of Punjab. So it was full to capacity, and yet the army was sent in, and as a result, thousands were killed, innocents. So for the excuse of trying to flush the temple of a handful of militants, the Indian government ended up with a massacre on their hands. And it seems as if the army, who made some losses on the first day, seem to have took their revenge. So there were many cases of Sikhs being killed at short or point blank range. Their hands were tied behind their back with their turbans. They were killed, many women and children. So there's lots of independent reports. The post-mortems that were carried out afterwards showed that indeed they were killed after being captured. So it was clearly a massacre of innocents. It could have been completely different. I mean, they could have taken another route, a more peaceful route, to flush out those militants. They could have laid siege to the Golden Temple, invited the media, made some negotiations and so forth. There could have been so many different paths to end that siege, but now we now know why. We know that there was a small clique around Mrs Gandhi who was bent on othering the Sikhs, scapegoating the Sikh community because they had the eye on the elections, and the Hindu bloc vote. And in order to do that, they created this myth that Sikhs were traitors, seditious, and Mrs Gandhi had no choice but to go in and flush them out. But it wasn't just the Golden Temple, it was 40 other shrines that were attacked on the same day. And then what followed was martial law, human rights abuses throughout the villages of Punjab. In fact, there was an army ordinance in July, a month after Operation Blue Star, the attack on Golden Temple, which explicitly labels Sikhs, practicing Sikhs, as terrorists. So that's a blatant, hate crime, really, which emanated from this small group around Mrs Gandhi, who were then implicated in the massacres that would take place 4 months later.
Right, sorry, there was a bit of a slip up there. I find that fascinating, Pav, actually, because, I mean, the massacre of the Sikhs in the Golden Temple, I mean, was there, after it all happened, was there any, I mean, I know there were 2 inquiries about the attack on Sikhs in Delhi and elsewhere, and we'll come to that later on, but was there any inquiry into that military operation against the Sikhs in the Golden Temple?
No, there was no inquiry from the government side in terms of an independent inquiry.
Yeah.
They did release a white paper a month after, which completely whitewashed the whole episode, and again talked about a kind of a foreign conspiracy by Pakistan to destabilize Punjab, and didn't mention anything to do with what Congress was doing in Punjab, cementing hatred between Hindus and Sikhs and encouraging extremism, which they had been doing throughout the 80s. So there was no mention of that. But the only independent report was done by the Citizens of Democracy. So this was an all-faith group who went in and interviewed those survivors of the attack on Golden Temple, and they're the ones who came out with a report which catalyzed the human rights abuses that were taking place at the time. The other interesting thing is the way the Indian government shut down the media just before they attacked the Golden Temple. So they ordered all foreign journalists to leave Punjab. Indian journalists weren't allowed to report. There was mass censorship during the days. It was only one reporter who managed to stay behind, a guy called Brahma Chalani, who then dispatched reports that were printed in The Guardian in this country, which talked about the postmortems that took place, and he interviewed some of the doctors who corroborated that there were human rights abuses that had taken place.
I mean, there is some suggestion that the Indian forces were aided and abetted by members of the special SAS from Britain. Is there any truth in that, or was there any role that the SAS and the British played in that attack on the Golden Temple?
Yeah, there is a role that the SAS played. According to them, it is more advisory as opposed to actually being involved. So a few years ago, according to the 30-year rule, the National Archive in Kew near London released documents relating to the events of 1984. And in those documents, it's quite clear that the then Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, on the request of the Indian government, dispatched the SAS to Punjab in February 1984 to sort of assess how the army could, or the police could, attack the Golden Temple. And the report has miraculously disappeared, so that's never been released. And there's quite a lot of papers that we are now calling for to be released by the British government, and we're also calling for an independent inquiry into the whole affair of British involvement into the Golden Temple. And it's quite shocking, really, because Sikhs all through the generations, in terms of the First World War and the Second World War, have made a large part of the British Army. 80,000 Sikhs were killed on the battlefields, of Europe and Northern Africa in both wars. You see pictures of them liberating Paris, liberating, Italy, and this is like the thanks they got from the British government in 1984, who kind of clearly had their eyes on billions of weapons and arms deals that they were had their eye on, and they were negotiating at the time with the Indian government. So for them, they trumped human rights for trade, as has been the case for the last 30-40 years in terms of the Indian government and the British government. If you look at the way they trade with Saudi Arabia and other despots around the world, and completely ignore human rights until it suits them. So obviously later on in the 80s, they did condemn China for the Tiananmen Square massacre, but nothing's ever been said about 1984 officially. And also from our opposition, the Labour Party and the Liberals, they've been very silent about the massacres of November 1984. They were the first to condemn the assassination of Mrs Gandhi, but yet that silence still continues.
Okay, Pav, let's move on now to the events to do with the actual massacre of Sikhs and that in North India. I mean, Mrs Gandhi is assassinated by her two Sikh guards. You've explained the context in which that took place. What happened then?
So immediately after the assassination, there was a group of eminent Sikhs, army chiefs, who got together in Delhi and sort of made a proclamation that they condemned the assassination, that it was against the secular ideals of the Constitution of India. But that was never taken up by the media. The media at the time was state-owned. Both Doordarshan, the TV station, and All India Radio was controlled by the then Congress Party. And they then began to allow the broadcast of anti-hate speech by mobs who were outside the hospital where Mrs Gandhi laid. So the famous blood for blood, Khoon da Kabla Badala Khoon, was broadcast for 3 days on a continuous loop on TV. So it's very, very similar to what happened in Rwanda, where the state radio station was allowed to broadcast hate speech against then the Tutsi minority. And then what happened was, and interestingly, for the first 24 hours, no Sikh, except one Sikh reported was killed. But on the whole, Sikh Hindu neighbors did not turn, upon their Sikh neighbors for 24 hours. Something else had to happen, and that was to create that atmosphere of hatred. So what the police did is go around colonies in Delhi and elsewhere with loudspeakers, saying that the Sikhs had poisoned the water, don't drink it. There were bodies of Hindus arriving in Delhi station from the Punjab. So really creating an atmosphere where this genocide could take place. On the evening of the 31st of October, senior Congress leaders, along with senior police, met to finalize the plan that had already been put in place months ago to put the genocide in place. And in the morning, there were mass meetings of mobs and Congress leaders, inciting them to kill Sikhs, rape their women. And this was done publicly. I mean, the Sikh temples, the Gurdwaras were the first places to be attacked. And then the police would move in, confiscate licensed firearms Sikhs might have had, and their swords they had to protect themselves. They were confiscated. The police assured them that they're protected and go back to your homes. And then a couple of hours later, the mobs would be allowed back into the colonies, and house by house, Sikhs were attacked. They were, thrown kerosene. There was a white powder, chemical powder that the mobs had, which is not readily available in India. Phosphorus chemical that was thrown on Sikhs and then burnt. Sikhs were burnt to the bone. And then you had a period where the surviving widows were gang raped, and many widows were kidnapped to outlying villages. So many sexual violence took place as well, which again is a hidden story. It's never been accounted for officially by any of the official accounts.
I mean, there's lots of shocking detail in your book, but one of the things that I think shocked me the most, and you've mentioned it, is the degree to which the forces of law and order, if you want to call them that, the police, actually disarmed the Sikh community in order to facilitate the massacres. That is really shocking when you think about it, because we all look towards the security forces, in theory at least, to provide us with protection, and that suggests something more than just one community attacking another. It looks as if it's planned. And one of the accusations you make in your book is that in fact the massacre of the Sikhs was planned before the assassination of Mrs Gandhi. Would you like to say something about that?
Yeah, we do now know that it seems as if the assassination just brought the genocide forward. The massacres were timed for the 8th of November to time with the birth of the first Sikh Guru, Guru Nanak Dev, where Sikhs would be collecting in the Sikh temples, the Gurdwara, and that's made them easy target. So we do have reports now that leader congressmen collected lists of Sikh businesses and homes just after Operation Blue Star, and it's those lists were then distributed to the mobs on the 31st of October and on the 1st of November. So this was a very meticulous operation. These death squads had the lists. They went into Sikh neighborhoods and called out the names for the Sikhs to be killed. And there's been countless stories of these mobs then returning not only twice, 3 times, but even 4 times to claim the bodies of a Sikh. And if they weren't crossed off on the list, they'd ask, well, where are they? Are they hiding? And they'd find a Sikh maybe hiding in a Hindu house, and that Sikh would be dragged out and killed publicly as well, you know, on the street. People knew that this was happening. I mean, this was a popular pogrom. You know, I mean, I've mentioned some Hindus and Muslims came to the help of Sikhs, but on the whole, the majority community were indifferent to the violence. You know, either involved in the massacres or just watched as if it was some Republican Day, you know, procession from their rooftops. So it seems as if the kind of propaganda that the government had been rolling out throughout the 80s, that Sikhs were a threat to the integrity of India, had seeped through, and you know, the popular feeling was that Sikhs needed to be taught a lesson, not only for the assassination of Mrs Gandhi, so for the act of 2 Sikhs to kill Mrs Gandhi, the whole community was targeted, but also for you know, there were attacks on Hindus in Punjab by groups that were not quite clear who was behind that. Some say they were backed by the police, but there were attacks on innocent Hindus as well, and that seems to have seeped through the minds of majority Hindus that Sikhs were a threat.
I mean, one of the central arguments of your book is the role of the Congress Party and the leadership of the Congress Party. I mean, you identify the nephew of Rajiv Gandhi, who became the Prime Minister, as being one of the key organisers. Well, would you like to talk a bit about what you see as being the role of the Congress Party in all of this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll correct you. It was his cousin.
Oh, right.
So Arun Nehru MP was one of the senior members of the Congress Party. In fact, he was probably more senior than Rajiv Gandhi, the Prime Minister. He took control of the Home Ministry after the assassination of Mrs Gandhi. He was also now implicated in collecting these lists 5 months before as well, and he was part of that clique who were involved in Operation Blue Star. So, and he was promoted after the massacres. He became a minister. So he's heavily involved. There were many Congress leaders in Delhi, particularly. So the likes of H.K.L. Bhagat, who was the MP for East Delhi, where most of the massacres took place. And he won a massive majority in the December election as well. There's only, you know, there's been 20 or 30 senior members who were involved, but there's only been one who's been convicted a few years ago, Sajjan Kumar MP, for his role in inciting people to violence. But you know, the rest of them been gone, you know, escaped justice. You know, literally hundreds and thousands of thousands of councillors were involved, local Congress leaders were involved, and at least 200 police chiefs were involved. And again, they escaped justice. So this is a monumental, you know, crime against humanity that the state inflicted on its citizens. You know, 8,000 Sikhs killed within 3 days in the world's largest democracy, and yet it's a shameful, you know, it's a shameful thing that we have in the center of Delhi now a widows' colony. It is really shameful. and that we have gone so away from the secular ideals and the constitution of India. And you know, I do fear for India even today, because you know, we do have a quite right-wing Hindu government who are bent on making India as a Hindu state. So yeah, it's not a great place for minority, not just for Sikhs and also for Muslims, but also Christians and low caste Hindus as well, you know, and so forth. So it seems as if gone the opposite of way of what the original freedom fighters wanted, you know, after independence. They fought for a secular, pluralistic India, not an India ruled by the majority.
Well, just on that, I mean, the BJP, that are obviously the government in India today, I'm not entirely certain whether the BJP as such existed in 1984. I mean, I think that the precursors obviously were there. Well, what I mean, in your book, you obviously and understandably focus on the role of the Congress Party. What was the sort of the forerunners of the BJP doing at this stage? Were they involved, do you think, in the massacres, or were they the Hindus who were looking on?
Yeah, the BJP at 84, they weren't big at all. I mean, they had small splinters. They had small kind of groups like the RSS and Shiv Sena at the time. But a lot of the RSS and Shiv Sena was very close to the Congress at the time. You know, in early '84, it's quite famous kind of mass meeting that Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister, attended just after the pogroms against the Muslims in Bombay at the time, and she shared the platform with the local RSS. And she famously said then that majorities have their rights too. So there was also, and in fact, that came from independence days. There was always a close connection between Congress and the RSS, a semi sort of fascistic kind of group that we have in India, who always called when these things happen. I think on the whole, because the Congress Party were in government, they are totally to blame, because they controlled the police, they controlled the army that was kept in their barracks, and it was their local members who carried out the massacres. But undoubtedly, there would have been on the ground, you know, members of the BJP would have been involved, and there's a handful of people who were involved, but not officially. I think officially you can say it was the Congress Party who were involved.
You mentioned there the army. Now, I mean, it's almost a rerunning, isn't it, of the partition of India, where there's massacres taking place and the army is kept in the barracks. And that's what you're saying happened in 1984. Were the army at all involved in trying to suppress the massacres, or were they constantly kept in the barracks?
No, they were constantly kept in the barracks. I mean, leading politicians pleaded with the new Prime Minister, Rajiv Gandhi, to call the army on the first day, and he kept them away. You know, it was deliberate. It was completely deliberate, and they were only called out on the third day when, you know, 8,000 Sikhs had already been killed. You know, there were a case of Sikh regiment who was out on the first day, and they were helping victims, and you know, some security person said, no, you've got to go back to your barracks. So it was plainly obvious that they wanted to keep the army away, so that these massacres could take place, and the police which was at that time very communalized and very much involved in what was taking place. They wanted a free run on what was taking place. You know, wherever the mobs were, the police accompanied them, and on the whole, they were, you know, just standing by, but also that in many instances they were involved in the killing of Sikhs. But yeah, it is really shameful, actually, the way the army was kept away and only brought in after day 4 to help the survivors.
Well, one of the interesting things that I find about these massacres, pogrom of Sikhs, is that it was almost all entirely confined to North India. Now, I must declare an interest here. I have a family that live in just outside of Bangalore. And I mean, apart from, I think in your book, you identify somewhere near Chennai, or Madras as it was called back in 1984, as a place where Sikhs were attacked. Was it the lack of Sikhs in South India, or was it just that, I mean, South India, generally speaking, is less communal in terms of its history than North India? Why do you think there were so few attacks in South India?
Yeah, there is truth in that there's few Sikhs in the south, but it was mainly because the northern India were Congress-led governments. So you had Congress-led governments in those states, and it was in those states that the massacres took place. So not only in Delhi, but also neighboring Haryana, Rajasthan, UP, and if you go even beyond, Uttar Pradesh as well. So, you know, Madhya Pradesh, lots of these areas were Congress-led governments, and that's why it was easy for the Congress to get those mobs out and enact that genocide. So that was the main reason.
Okay, I mean, one of the points you make during in your book is the way in which the official version of events, they describe the pogrom as riots, and obviously you don't accept that. Why not? I mean, what's your understanding of the difference between a riot and a pogrom?
So the first thing that the new Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi said, in fact, he had a mass meeting after the massacres, was that these were riots. Some riots took place, and then he compared it to the felling of a tree, so sort of a natural phenomena. So this was natural, and the earth shook. So that's always been the official line particularly from the Congress Party, that this was attacks in revenge to the assassination, and it was spontaneous, and there was no organization involved. Whereas we now know that, you know, it was heavily organized by the Congress Party months in advance. It was premeditated, and it was targeted on one community. So I think obviously they were involved, and they wanted the finger to be pointed elsewhere. You know, their own members were involved. You know, Rajiv, you know, the Gandhi family members were involved. So in order to deflect and also to minimize the violence, the nature of the violence, so no mention of rape, no mention that it was targeted. So this talk of a communal riot. So communal riots in India normally are two communities fighting amongst each other. You know, the famous Hindu-Muslim riots of 1947 and so forth. But as in 1984, November 1984, it was Sikhs who were getting killed. The majority, you know, they were targeted as a community, you know, in whole or in part. The definition of genocide, you know, there was attempts definitely to wipe them out in many areas. So it was a clear kind of strategy of officialdom to, you know, absolve their involvement in those massacres. Even to this day, they just talk about, you know, some congressman, or probable. They used vague terms in terms of what actually took place.
Okay, let's move on now to the aftermath of the pogroms. And in your book, you talk about there were two. This is where the analogy with Bloody Sunday actually becomes quite interesting. I mean, there were two judicial inquiries, just as there's been two on Bloody Sunday. Tell us a bit about those inquiries. There was one, I think, almost immediately afterwards, and then there was one, what, 2005 or thereabouts.
Yeah. So after the massacres, were called for the government to set up an independent inquiry, and for months the new Prime Minister, rejected those calls. He said they would open up old wounds, and that the matter had been dealt with. So that was the line, and he only agreed to it when he had to make a deal with the Sikh party, the Akali Dal, a year later. So he was kind of forced to set up an inquiry, but that inquiry wasn't independent. He appointed the judge, who later became a Congress MP. It was a real joke. It really was. He rejected the judge rejected a lot of the testimonies and lots of the affidavits from the victims. He blatantly ignored the rapes, the killings of children as well. And his line was that this was, again, a spontaneous reaction, a communal riot. So completely whitewashed, and then exonerated the key members who were involved, the perpetrators who were involved in the massacres. And then we had in 2005 the Nanavati Commission, who again exonerated a lot of the police officers involved, exonerated the Home Minister, the Prime Minister, who in my mind was sort of the facilitator of the genocide. And he used, again, vague terms in terms of probable involvement of some Congress MPs. So again, a real whitewashing of what actually took place. So even to this day, we've never had an independent inquiry into what took place. Yeah,
I'm intrigued about the first inquiry. You're saying there about how the judge, Judge Misra, refused to accept most of the testimony from eyewitnesses and civilians. That's exactly what happened with the Widgery inquiry, of course, in 1972.
Yeah, but what's worse actually is that he also invited to the court anti-victim groups. So these were sort of right-wing groups who were involved in the massacres, who came into the court and started intimidating the victims. So that it's a really shameful way he operated. He was blatantly there to protect the perpetrators. It was very blatant. He kept the media away. So there was a media ban on reporting on that inquiry, and then he allowed these groups in who intimidated, and it was very difficult for victims to actually say their side of the story.
I mean, another parallel with Bloody Sunday is that, I mean, in 2010, the then Prime Minister David Cameron gave an apology in the House of Commons. Manmohan Singh, who was Prime Minister in 2005, he also made an apology.
Yeah.
But I think you're a lot more critical of his apology than perhaps people here are of David Cameron's. What do you make of Manmohan Singh, who himself is a Sikh, making an apology?
Yeah, I mean, the notion of a Sikh actually making an apology for a massacre of Sikhs seems quite bizarre to me. It should really have come from, the president of Congress, Sonia Gandhi, the wife of Rajiv Gandhi, other people. It just seems bizarre. It's like asking a Jew to apologize for the Holocaust on behalf of the German government. It's a quite bizarre thing. But that apology really, on the one sense, it sort of tried to calm Sikhs, but on the other, it was saying move on, and he didn't call out his own members in his own party who were involved at all. In fact, he went a step further and actually justified some of them and protected some of those members as well. So it was sort of an apology without action, and try to sort of cover up what actually took place. So a non-apology, really, in my view.
Okay, I've nearly run out of the points that I want to make, Pav, and we'll move over to questions in a minute. But And one of the things that happened here in Derry after Bloody Sunday eventually was that we set up a museum of what's called the Museum of Free Derry. And if you come to Derry, and I hope one day you will, maybe you've been already, I don't know, but that you visit the museum, which tells the story of the civil rights struggle and also what happened on Bloody Sunday, and the campaign mainly led by relatives to get the names of their loved ones exonerated and to get the blame rested on the British Army. Has there anything like that happened in India? I mean, was there and is there a campaign from amongst the Sikh community to get a proper inquiry? Is there any kind of place, if you were to go to Delhi, for example, a museum that would tell the story of what happened to the Sikh community?
Yeah, and I think it's a really good idea to have a museum, and I think the Free Derry Museum is amazing. I'd love to come to Derry one day and visit it. I mean, I followed, you know, the events in the 80s and 90s during the Troubles. I mean, one of my favorite books is War and an Irish Town by one of your Delhiites, maybe I don't know what you call them, who live in Delhi, but Eamon McCann.
He used to be the chairman of the Bloody Sunday Trust.
Did he? Okay.
Yeah, one time.
So I have followed what has been taking place, you know, during the Troubles, and obviously before that the civil rights movement. But you know, we don't have an official museum in India in a public space. It would not be allowed. So we do have a small museum in one of the Sikh Gurdwara in central Delhi, with a few pictures of the victims, but nothing else. So yeah, there's a real need really to sort of start collecting a lot of the stories and the narratives and sort of save them for future generations. But you know, India doesn't like to remember. That's the thing with India officialdom. They don't remember 1947 in terms of what happened. It's sort of the partition of India is a sort of a frozen thing that few like to talk about. Not only in India, but in Pakistan as well. You know, yeah, there's so many stories of what took place, the massacres, you know, the rapes. And again, in 1984, people just say, "Oh, just move on." It's like as if there's no kind of acknowledgement and closure to this. And you know, this has been going on for 3 decades now, and there's been no attempt to close, no attempt properly to indict the guilty, no attempt to learn the lessons, no attempt to reform the police, no attempt to actually investigate why the judiciary covered up this for 3 decades. And you know, the whole issue of sexual violence has never been dealt with. The help, you know, the trauma that the Sikh community has gone through, no help at all with the children that had to witness these crimes and are orphaned now and are in menial jobs. Many succumb to suicide and drugs over the years. You know, you have a sort of intergenerational trauma that has taken place in India in these communities, and many people actually left. That's why you have Sikhs all over the world, and you know, in England and also in Ireland and Northern Ireland. You know, a lot of people had to escape those pogroms, but that story has never been told. It's kind of a hidden trauma that people still carry.
Okay, before I hand over to questions, just one other point which we talked about before we started, which is the current unrest in India, which is, anybody who's been watching it will know that there have been massive strikes throughout India, actually, against the attempt by the BJP to modernize agriculture. And a lot of that resistance, it's very obvious, has been led by Sikhs, who obviously, many Sikhs in the Punjab and Haryana and so on are farmers. What's your take on all of that, as a sort of British Sikh looking into what's happening in India?
Yeah, it's an amazing protest movement. It's almost like India's Arab Spring. This is been going on for months, in fact, in the Punjab in particular, for probably about 6 months. But the last 2 months, there've been mass protests outside Delhi. There's 3 or 4 camps where farmers have mass protested peacefully. There was a march into Delhi a few days ago on Republic Day. Lots of women are involved with what's taking place. So yeah, a real kind of a show of opposition, probably the biggest opposition to the Modi government we've seen for years. And you're quite right, Sikhs have been ahead of those movements, but lots of farmers and throughout India, non-Sikhs are involved too. I mean, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of farmers who are involved in this mass movement, and it literally is a mass movement, a popular movement. And you can see now in the last few days attempts by the government to malign that movement, to be anti-national, Khalistani, bent on breaking India. And they've actually unleashed only yesterday their thugs on some of the farmer groups. And the police blatantly watching while these sort of right-wing groups go in and attack the farmers. So, although it's fantastic, it's brilliant, you can see that, there's going to be a crackdown very soon on these farmers. And yet these farmers are fighting for their livelihoods. The privatization and commercialization of the farming economy is going to devastate farmers throughout India. We've already got record suicides of farmers, hundreds of thousands over the last few decades, and that's going to increase because of debt, because the sort of commercial and the big kind of industrialists want to go and land grab land now in Punjab and throughout northern India and throughout India, and that's a really sorry state. It's sort of a new neoliberalism that's taking place. India is, if you ever go to India, it's a very contrasting country. They're very rich people and there's very poor people. Any town you go to, you will see shanty towns are poor. And the new liberalism has not solved that problem. It's so unequal, that society. It really does need a social revolution, in my view.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to hand over to Kira now, I think, because she's got some questions for us, or comments possibly. And before I hand over to her, just thank you, Pav, for your presentation. I know it's quite demanding to go through, spend nearly an hour going through events, even though you're obviously very knowledgeable. Thanks very much. So, Kira, questions?
Hi, Pav. So the first question is from Simra, and she is saying, Irish nationalists who lived in exile in America continued the struggle for free Ireland abroad. With this in mind, what role did Dr. Jagjit Singh Chauhan, and I apologise if my pronunciation isn't very good, President of the Republic of Khalistan, who resided in London, play in the 80s, and what did you make of his character?
Thank you for that, and thank you, Simran, for that really good question. And I do cover the Khalistan movement, although briefly in my book, but I do cover the role of Jagjit Singh Chauhan, who was the so-called president of Khalistan in exile. So my take on it was a bit of a joke character. I mean, he sort of had his sort of embassy in exile in London, produced Khalistan passports and currency, and he did come on national TV calling for the death of Mrs Gandhi. So I don't think he was totally aware of what he was doing, how that would impact on Sikhs in India. You know, you got to remember, Sikhs are a minority in India, only 2% of the population. So any sort of proclamation like that outside has an impact on India. So really, really got to be careful. So I don't think he forwarded the movement at all in terms of civil rights and human rights. You know, I think he was a former minister, Punjab minister anyway, and then once he got out power, he decided to leave and join this Khalistani movement. You know, my view of Khalistan is, I'd ask the question, will that solve the problem of Sikhs, you know, having a small state, landlocked state, or not? You know, I don't think it will. I think the future of Sikhs is India. Sikhs have sacrificed so much in the independence movement for an India, but for secular India. So that's where I worry about India today. It's going away from secularism. You know, but you know, for me, Sikhs should be spreading their faith in terms of, you know, the egalitarian side of their faith, helping people in terms of food and shelter, which is a very big part of the faith, Sikh faith. And I think that's something that we should do throughout India, you know, uplift India socially, as opposed to becoming exclusive within the state. I mean, we see, I mean, I'm not a big fan of religious-based states. You know, you can only see that in Pakistan, where, you know, Islamic states where minorities are routinely hounded. Sikhs, Hindus, Christians, you know, that's not a state I prescribe to. And I certainly don't want India to become a mirror of Pakistan.
Okay, thank you, Pav. And the next question is from, well, there's a question and a comment from Onkar. So the question is, what actions did the Sikh leaders take in 1984? And his comment is, to have a museum would be an acknowledgement that a pogrom took place. So it would be interesting to get your response to those two.
Yeah, I'll answer the last one first. Museum, absolutely. We do need a museum, but it needs to be in a public space in India where, you know, everyone can come in. So it doesn't, I don't believe in confining this story within the community. And I think far too long the Sikh community confined the story of 1984 within the walls of the Gurdwara and the temples. So we really do need it in the public space. Absolutely. I think the Sikh leaders, so if you're talking about the Sikh leaders after the massacres, so there are Sikhs in the Congress party who covered up shamefully the massacres. You know, the president of India is a Sikh. He could have resigned. You know, the journalists who came to him said, look, we've seen the bodies in the morgues, thousands of them, and your members have done this. And he just couldn't do anything. He said, I can't do anything. Even the prime minister's not answering my phone. He could have done something and made a stand, and he didn't. And quite shamefully, he actually awarded some of the police officers with medals afterwards. You know, Sikh Congress members are very shameful, and some of the members in East Delhi submitted affidavits to protect the perpetrators. So there's a long history of the last 3 decades of these leaders protecting the perpetrators, which is a real shame, really.
Okay, and there's a question from Maeve from the Bloody Sunday Trust. She's asking, well, she's saying, first of all, that there are many similarities. What can Derry do to support demands for release of documents or to support the call for an inquiry into the events of 1984? And also, if the apology was attached to a process or inquiry, would it have more impact?
Yeah, so I think there's two things that will make things more transparent. So I think on the British side, we are calling for the British government to release all documents relating to 1984 and after. So we need the full picture. So we do know that there's an SAS document that's mysteriously disappeared, and some of those had copies in other departments. They've now been withdrawn, so they need to be released. Absolutely. And I think for India, you know, I'm calling for something that we had in South Africa and South America and Bosnia, something called the Truth and Justice Reconciliation Commission, and it needs to be independent. So we need an independent Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which we can scope by the victims' groups, really led by the victims as opposed to the politicians, and we can start to create an environment where even those who know the truth about what took place in 1984 can come out and let us know exactly what happened. So I'm talking about the bureaucracy. I'm talking about people in civil service who knew about how the weapons were, you know, collected, how this mysterious chemical phosphorus was procured. You know, who told the Sikh policemen to go home, where they were then attacked by mobs, who kept the army in the barracks. All these things that we need desperately to know. There's lots of things, questions that are unanswered. So I think a kind of a truth commission is the only way we can get the truth out. And it worked to some extent quite successfully in South Africa, where there were cases, you know, there's so many, you know, November 1984 is one story, but we also had lots of abuses in the Punjab for a whole decade afterwards. So we had a whole decade where there were, you know, judicial, extrajudicial executions of innocents, rapes, disappearances. And lots of those families have never known what happened to their loved ones. So in a way, we can try and get to the truth. I think it may not happen in this administration. I can guarantee it won't, but I'm looking in future administration who, an India and a Congress party who say, look, we got it wrong. You know, we'll put our hands up of what our members did in '84, and that's the kind of administration and the environment we want to move towards. And you know, internationally, we need to put pressure on India to do that.
Thank you, Pav. So there's another question from Paul, and he says, can you tell us more about the widows' camp in the centre of Delhi?
Yeah, thanks, Paul, for that question. As I mentioned, there's 3 or 4 camps in Delhi. The most famous one is called Tilak Vihar. Tilak Vihar means widows colony. There's also another colony next door to it, Tilak Nagar, which I'd visited as well. So these were set up immediately after the massacres. So a lot of these Sikh communities fled places, mainly in East Delhi, but also in West Delhi, in the outskirts of Delhi, where the massacres had taken place. And the government allowed them to have these colonies, but they were in dilapidated housing. I mean, it was, you know, dreadful. And they were also asked to pay rent as well. So, you know, throughout the decades by the government, quite shamefully. You know, the widows were given menial jobs or no jobs at all. You know, real terrible deprivation. In fact, even after the massacres, they were given hardly any rations at all. And then what the police did is slowly allow drug groups to go in and drugs to take hold. So a lot of the orphans succumbed to drug abuse and suicide as well. In fact, there's lots of cases of suicides of the orphans and also rape victims, the women as well. So it really is a dire story which carries on to this day.
Yeah, it's harrowing stuff. So there's a question from Colm, and he is saying, The Irish are often accused of being obsessed with remembering. You said that India doesn't like to remember. Why is that, do you think?
I think it mainly is because of officialdom. So we've inherited not the most progressive governments since independence. We really have, particularly from the 80s onwards, and even in the 70s. You've got to remember, in 1975 we had an emergency for 2 years. Now that emergency was basically a dictatorship. So Mrs Gandhi imposed pretty much martial law, imposed the mass sort of the banning of media and imprisoned opposition leaders for 2 years. And there was mass sterilization that took place by her son Sanjay Gandhi. So this is the kind of governments we've had. And then throughout the 80s, the communal card was played by the Congress Party to scapegoat minorities. So really, 84 signaled the genie that was let loose. It was Rajiv Gandhi then opened the gates to the Ayodhya mosque, which then allowed the Hindutva movement, the Hindu chauvinist movement, to take hold. So for me, the real genie of Hindu nationalism was opened in 1984, but that was taken on by the BJP, and that's why the BJP are strong and powerful now. So yeah, that's why we've got this sort of state sanction of human rights abuses and cover-ups that doesn't allow remembering. They don't want they want you to remember anything. They take so much to ban free speech. I mean, there've been cases of journalists being killed of late. Only in the last couple of days, journalists have been, called to court. Sedition charges have been made against them. This has been happening for years. And India likes to ban things as well. So they'll ban books, ban publications. Even after 1984, there were publications, independent reports that were banned, and even documentaries that were banned. There's a famous case of our own author, Salman Rushdie, who attempted to document one of the widow's testimonies in one of his documentaries, and the Indian government, and shamefully the Indian High Commission in London, tried to ban that testimony. Luckily, he got it out in his famous documentary, The Riddle of Midnight, which ends with the voice of the widow who'd lost her kids and husband in the pogroms. But this is a sad story of India. They don't want the truth to come out, and unfortunately, they definitely don't want to remember anything.
It's interesting. It's a massive democracy, but it's not behaving very democratically. Pav, could you tell us about how hospitals were closed during the massacre so they could not treat injured Sikhs?
Yeah, I was shocked when I started reading some of the testimonies of the victims. So for the first 2 or 3 days of when the massacres took place, so you can remember a lot of the injuries were burn injuries, so people who were burnt partially or fully, who needed medical help, and yet burns units in Delhi were closed, unbelievably closed. It was shocking. And then many of the victims who went to hospitals were turned away, and then mobs outside would be waiting for them. Many cases where doctors refused to treat them. So this sort of very anti-Sikh propaganda had seeped through to the public in a big way. So yeah, it was quite shocking. There's so many stories of people who weren't treated properly and died in many of the hospitals which I've named in the book. So again, we need an inquiry into that, what took place.
Yeah. We have a question from Simon. Simon is saying, as a Sikh who has lived through the Northern Ireland Troubles and known victims and families throughout these historical shameful events, I have friends from many communities and faiths internationally. Why are we not learning from mistakes of the past? Sorry, I'll just get the rest of it. Is the education system teaching history to paint a fake picture? Should we be changing the system to teach the truth based on what is right and humanitarian? And how can we do this through existing institutions? Or should we do this through existing institutions, I think?
It's a really good question, Simon. And I think we do have a problem in India where we don't learn lessons. We absolutely don't. If the lessons of 1994 have been learnt and the perpetrators brought to justice, the massacres 1992 against the Muslims and the massacre in 2002 in Gujarat against Muslims would not have happened. You know, in those cases, the police were involved, the state officials were involved, and it seems as if there's impunity given to the perpetrators. Looking at 1984, they thought, actually, we can get away with this. You know, the Congress did it in 1984, let's do it in 2002. So there definitely is a recurring theme of repeating these massacres and genocides of late. But yeah, absolutely, we need education to teach people exactly what happened, as opposed to sort of relying on government whitewashed inquiries. Absolutely, I totally agree with that. Whether governments would allow that is another thing.
Yeah, Onkar has said in response to that, the education system in the UK is not teaching about empire and colonialism, which is a very good point. If you talk about, you know, you could maybe draw parallels between the Hindu genie and the British genie in a way. No one wants to confront these ugly histories.
Yeah, I totally agree. Absolutely. I think, I mean, luckily the Black Lives Movement has opened the debate in terms of, you know, the need to talk about alternative histories and histories from the point of view of victims of, you know, slavery, or whether it's racism in general. Absolutely, it's absolutely. I mean, I'm kind of hopeful in this country that that's happening now. That's what we need in India. We do need a kind of a more transparent period where we can start judging what took place and calling people out, officialdom out.
Yeah, Pav, you've talked about the current ruling party in India today, and how you're kind of worried for Indian politics today. But what about young people? I mean, young Sikhs and Hindus in India, is there an awareness of events? Do you think there's an appetite to confront the past, or, you know, how do you see that at the moment?
So I did a book event quite similar to this, with a book club in India recently, virtually. So the guy who was interviewing me, you know, has many subscribers, people who love books and so forth. And he says to me, look, this history that you were telling me about 1984, he didn't know anything about it. And he was saying, this isn't taught. None of my friends know about this. The generation of young Indians do not know about these stories, and they've been told a lie, really. So I think it's a start. I think the more we talk about these things and get the truth out, the more we can change mindsets. So yeah, I think that's, for me, I'm hopeful that the new generation will start confronting what took place. You know, ask their, you know, parents, ask their uncles and aunts, so what did you do in 1984? Were you the ones who were just watching while people were burnt, or, you know, did you help Sikhs? It's a question that, you know, Germans had to ask after the Holocaust, and it took them decades to confront the Holocaust. It's only until the 70s that actually Germans started confronting the crimes of their parents. So I think that's something that we need to start doing in India, really, because India needs to move forward And there are so many problems in India. You know, I've explained the big gap between rich and poor, the position of women, the position of low caste Hindus, and so on and so forth. And we need kind of a new kind of enlightened generation who can start confronting these and start talking about these issues in a progressive manner, not in a communal manner.
We have a lovely comment from Simon who's saying we need to do something good. We Sikhs are learners, and he's saying I want to invite you to my home in Derry and our Gurdwara and start dialogue and be doers for a better world to keep the memory of John Hume, who understood the importance of education and taught me love and assertiveness. We need to get together and change thoughts and behaviours of our children.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the most brightest, enlightened things I've seen is that, you know, the image of McGuinness and Ian Paisley together, you know, a few years ago, where they, you know, they were such good friends, and it just, you know, just proves that, you know, the most people on the opposite ends of the divide can come together like that. It's such an amazing image that is always stuck in my mind. You know, things can overcome, and I think Northern Ireland has proved that. And now you have a government of both faiths joined together, you know, to progress as a, you know, a region, as a people. So it's really enlightening. I think that's something that we'd envy and love to do in India, and also in England as well. You know, you have these extreme, you know, divides, but, you know, hopefully, I mean, if you look at America now, you know, there's so many problems and divisions. I'm just hoping that the new administration can actually do the same and bring people together. I think it'll be a lot harder in America, but that's the way we should definitely go. And Simon's right, it's part of the Sikh faith to bring people together. The whole point of Sikhism is to act as a bridge between communities. You know, our philosophy is each to their own. It's not trying to convert people to our faith. It's, you know, we believe everyone has different paths to the same goal, and in essence we are humans. You know, you know, our last guru, you know, said to the Sikh followers, you know, this, you know, see humanity as one. You know, the human race is one caste. That is your mission, to bring people together.
Pav, there's a very good question from Onkar. So there's a media blackout now at farmers' protests. The Sikhs have been denounced as terrorists because they hoisted a Sikh flag at Red Fort in Delhi. Do you think there could be another 1984?
Yeah, it really worries me, the events that are taking place. And you can see it's kind of almost becoming a rerun of the events just before 1984, where Sikhs are now being maligned as being anti-national and seditious. You know, unfurling the Nishan Sahib, which is the Sikh flag, which you see everywhere in India. I mean, you know, the Prime Minister of India has held it. Even on Republic Day, it's there side by side with the Indian flag. I don't see it being an issue. But the first thing the Indian media did is called it a Khalistan flag, which is not. You know, this is it's just saying to India, look, we are also a part of India. We can be, you know, side by side with the Indian flag. I didn't have an issue with that, but you can see how the media again has taken the side of the government to malign Sikhs. But I think they're maligning all farmers now. You know. But I think we just need to make sure we keep unite across all faiths, and don't let them divide us. You know, they are few, we are many.
Thank you. If anyone wants to submit some more questions, you can just put them in the chat box. We still have time for more questions. Well, I want to ask Pav, so you're kind of talking about the role of the media in terms of stirring up hatred and stirring up feeling, but you know, with all that's happened this year kind of across the world with fake news on social media, is social media being used as a tool to stir up hatred as well and tensions?
It is, yeah, absolutely. You can see that, you know, these sort of bots, you call them, or fake accounts. And my main criticism with particularly Twitter is that they don't, you know, they allow these fake accounts to take place without proving people's identity. So that's something that they really need to sort out. And it allows governments even to sort of, and you can see that in America with right-wing groups, you know, and their hatred online. So it's a real issue. But there is also good journalists on the ground who are using social media. So we've got a few actually part of the farmers protesting. If it wasn't for them, we would not know the truth of what's taking place, because we can't rely on you know, the official media. So yeah, absolutely.
Do we have any more questions from the audience?
Well, I think we're probably best to wrap it up now, Kira. Can I? It's Robin Percival again. Can I say very much a very big thank you to Pav for leading this seminar around the 1984 massacre of Sikhs in India following the assassination of Mrs Gandhi. And again, can I recommend his book? I mean, Pav Singh, 1984, India's Guilty Secret, and it's you can get it as an ebook. You can also pay $12.99, and I'm sure if you inundate Jenny Doherty's bookshop in Foyle Street, she will order copies from the publisher Kashi House. It is, I can recommend it. It's a very good read. It's well sourced and documented, and it provides very much the gruesome evidence that a pogrom took place, and that the issues are still very much alive. So on that point, can I again say thank you, Pav, for giving us the benefit of your insights on this. I hope everybody who was here found it worthwhile and instructive, because this is one of these events that maybe people are vaguely aware of, but aren't entirely certain of the details. And I think we're now in a much better position. And I think one of the things that you could be certain of is that the trust, the Bloody Sunday Trust, will go away and reflect on this particular seminar and think of ways possibly that we might be able to take some of these issues forward. So again, thank you very much, Pav. Have a nice day. And for those of you who aren't zoomed out, there's another live Zoom session starting at 1 o'clock with Connor Costick. And again, there's an Indian connection because it's about the Connaught Rangers mutiny, which took place in the Punjab in 1920, and in which 2 Derry men were involved. But it's not really about India, even though it took place in India. Of course, it's about Ireland and these Irish soldiers who mutinied, and one of whom was shot, executed, and he was the last man executed in the British Army for mutiny. So there's that. There's other events which you can look at the program on the Facebook page of the Museum of Free Derry, and also the Facebook page of the Bloody Sunday Trust. You may not even know there is one, but there is. and the rest of the events are actually pre-recorded, but nevertheless, people should look at them because well, so far they've been very good. Okay, that's it, folks. Goodbye, and again, thanks to Pav.
Thanks, Robin. Thank you.